Our speaker tonight is the Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities and is also a visiting professor at Brown University. Formerly, he served as a research professor at U.S. Naval War College for 20 years. In that post, he was awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal for founding leading the China Maritime Studies Institute. His main areas of expertise include both maritime security and nuclear security issues. Major focus areas have also recently included the Arctic, as well as the Korean Peninsula. He has published 7 books on Chinese strategy, including Meeting China Halfway. He speaks both Chinese and Russian and is currently writing a book on China-Russian relations. He has a PhD from Princeton, an MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS, and a BA from Harvard. So a warm virtual welcome to Professor Goldstein. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure. I'm really glad to join you. Big fan of JQA Society. It's fantastic what you all are doing.
Fantastic. So I guess we'll go ahead and just dive right in here with kind of the big question is, how is China currently reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks so much. This question is on everybody's mind. I think, let's cut to the chase. China, if China is firmly behind Russia, then unquestionably Russia is in a much stronger position. On the other hand, if China has doubts and kind of reins in its support of the relationship, or goes along with sanctions, for example, where Russia's in a very different place, no question in my mind. So this is a really pivotal question. Some have even suggested China could be a mediator. We can talk about that. I think there are some interesting possibilities there. But let me, I worked for the military for 20 years, and I can tell you in the military, they certainly like it if they like their bottom line up front. What do we need to know here? What is the bottom line? And I think my take is that the China-Russia relationship is very strong. It's robust. This didn't start yesterday. This has been growing and growing over the course of at least 3 decades, really even longer. And you have a relationship that has, it's kind of both broad and deep. And therefore, the idea that the relationship would be severely shaken by this, I think, is quite wrongheaded. I think, how to put it, some people would like to kind of the sort of hoping that China would sort of think the better of it, would see all the awful pictures that we're all seeing. And let me add my voice to saying, how appalled I am by what we are seeing in the Russian invasion. But unfortunately, China and Russia are very tight. I think the Chinese, if they weren't certain this was going to happen, they understood that it was a possibility for sure. I can imagine myself that the Chinese have been preparing for this for a long time. And, I think we'll come to this later, but there are a lot of echoes of Taiwan here. And, I must say, I think one of the first news items that came out after the Russian invasion was a leaked guidance. I think it was to Xinhua or something that said something like China must support Russia because they need Russia's support in a Taiwan scenario. Of course, a Taiwan scenario would involve not just a lot of horrible destruction, but also economic sanctions, so forth. So you can bet Chinese have thought about this carefully and are watching carefully what goes on. But my general take, John, is that I expect look, China's not going to go all in to support Russia. They did abstain in the UN on this, where some countries, North Korea and so forth, said they supported Russia. But the point is they will sort of minimize their losses. And I think they do fear for, what will happen to Chinese companies and Chinese trading relationships. Sure, that will impact their assessment, and they'll probably look for kind of a middle ground. But that middle ground will be distinctly kind of pro-Russian in character, and they will go to bat for Russia, and they will. Most important, John, I would underline this point. My own view: they will not let Russia collapse. They will not let they will not allow the Putin regime to go down to the extent that they can prevent that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating way to start. And just a quick note to our audience here: if you have your own questions here tonight, please use the Q&A feature here on Zoom. It's the one with the two bubbles, not the one bubble. So please use that Q&A feature if you have questions of your own. But I'd love to kind of continue to peel that onion back of the final part of what you were saying, that the Chinese won't let Putin collapse. I guess I assume that maybe we mean financially here in terms of like the SWIFT banking system and maybe providing the support for the Russians being taken off the SWIFT system. Can you maybe provide a little bit more background of what measures the Chinese are taking and might take to kind of secure that Putin regime does not fall?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons why I say that is in some sense, we have been here before. In 2014, 2015, there was a pretty serious crisis, of course, in between Ukraine and Russia. That was the time when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. The war started in Donbass. There was a lot of violence in Donbass, and major sanctions were put on Russia at that time. And I remember watching the Chinese very carefully, and really, it was quite amazing, the steps really that China took at that time to show support for Russia, but also to kind of help stabilize the Kremlin when it was clear that the Kremlin finances were in deep trouble. And I believe it was about that time. I think it was in the spring of 2015. Floating an enormous deal, cutting an enormous deal. I think the biggest gas deal ever made. So this was hundreds of billions of dollars going to Russia from China to secure these gas deals, and that played a major role. And they were ready to do more, from what I understand. So this gives me confidence in saying that China will take steps, pretty extreme steps, and of course these circumstances are even more, dire, I think, for Russia. I'm not an expert in monetary theory. I think we may all look to those people to see exactly the mechanics of how this will be done. But the rumors are there about new ways of moving currency, new ways of pricing commodities. I'm seeing on Russian websites, I think Russians have understandably been a bit leery about going in all in on China. I mean, to state the obvious, one reason that they've been kind of tepid about China is they have had a decent relationship with Japan and with South Korea too. And India. So to kind of balance all those Asian powers, Russia has kind of played this carefully. But, I think it's fair to say the new structure emerging in the Asia Pacific will see a much closer relationship, including on the financial side. Even today, I think there was some news about how this a new kind of monetary union. I think I haven't read all the details on that, but I'm seeing articles in Russian in the Russian press, for example, in Izvestia a couple of days ago, there was an article saying, that the renminbi is where it's at, and that Russians should move as much of their savings as they can into trading renminbi. The renminbi, of course, is pegged to the dollar. So, and it's, as long as I've been going to China, which is nearly 3 decades, the renminbi has been quite a stable currency. So I can imagine why Russians are, seeking that kind of stability, quite understandable in these circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. And I think maybe the best way to move this conversation forward is actually maybe taking a step back. Something that I'm always kind of aware of and have heard for quite some time is kind of this natural rivalry that the Chinese and the Russians should have, geopolitically speaking. They share a border and they're both very nationalist countries at the end of the day. So I guess what is, from your perspective, what's kind of driving this unholy alliance? And looking forward, is there still potential ways to exploit these natural differences that these countries have?
Yeah. It's an interesting point, John, and I know a lot of Americans are interested in that, and there's good reason. I mean, going way back, and I think history is an incredibly important equation here. I mean, in this book that I'm working on, I really try to go back, 400 years and look at the origins of Russia-China relations. And I mean, one thing to say at the outset, it's quite remarkable that these Asian giants, whose relationship is not, it doesn't go back 1,000 years, really. It doesn't. It's more like 400 years, so maybe 500 on a stretch. But to the beginnings of the Silk Road, Peter the Great took a great interest in the Asia Pacific and these kind of trade routes. But it's important to say that Russia and China, despite being neighbors and having a very long relationship, right, they've never had a big war. They've had some skirmishes, including in 1969. I did my dissertation actually on that. Which was a severe crisis, a war-threatening crisis. But in the end, it was a skirmish, and it's important to keep in mind. So, I mean, that I think is a kind of, how to put it, it kind of dampens our interest, or not our interest, but the case that there are natural rivals, I think it deserves to be scrutinized. Look, the reason why I think many Americans have kind of that is almost like conventional wisdom as we look at Russia-China relations is as follows. During the Cold War, you had this very dramatic episode where Russia and China went from being, close allies, very close allies, extremely, it's shocking how close they were in the 1950s to turning around within a decade to being, enemies. So that was a shocking turn of events. And I don't want to minimize that. I mean, you still have some legacy of distrust. I'll give you an example. Not long ago, there was a headline in Nezavisima Gazeta. That's a Russian paper I read a lot. The headline was "The Forgotten War." Right now, when Americans think about the Forgotten War, we're talking about the Korean War, right? But this was about that war. It wasn't a war; it was a skirmish on Damansky Island. But people died, and this was kind of remembering those Russian soldiers who were killed. And what I'm saying is so there are people who remember this, and there are, you can find in Moscow there are people who I might call China hawks. And in Beijing, you can find some people who are kind of Russia skeptics, but they're fewer and fewer, to be honest. And I think after the events of 2022, there may be even fewer. But since 2014, the relationship has been tightening and tightening. But having that historical perspective is important. And I do think, we don't want to veer in the other direction, meaning like we're sure this relationship is so close that they would never look for alternatives. I think, honestly, there's a certain maturity in Russia-China relations. That is, they know they had a close relationship, very close in the 1950s. And before that, going back to the 20s. The Chinese Revolution was partly Russian in character. I mean, unquestionably, the Soviets were involved in the Chinese Revolution. No question in my mind. We can talk about all that history as well. And that's powerful. And that is being remembered today. But look, the relationship did go off the rails completely. And they both know that. And so they both know that Russia and China suffered as a result of that. That was both of them were kind of weaker after that. And, both of them, I think, glimpsed what a disaster could result from Russia-China, military rivalry, for example. And I think that's in both Moscow and Beijing, it's appreciated that they don't want to do that again. So that's a quite important ballast. And what you see resulting is the primary basis is pragmatism, just to kind of, it works for both countries. We have no particular ideology, and this sort of satisfies both countries' interests to move forward. so that's the basis. But there is actually developing now a kind of ideological basis for this, which is kind of the ideology of really anti-Western thinking. That to develop like a counterpoint to the West, a counterweight, and really a kind of anti-American view of the world, which is disturbing. And it makes one wonder, of course, what, if we might somehow go a different direction. I mean, at some point, maybe John will discuss this issue of multipolarity, but that certainly is they have kind of a shared vision of multipolarity. And that's part of their philosophy, their sort of jointly held philosophy too.
Yeah. And I think maybe there is a good opportunity to maybe start transitioning towards that kind of right now, I guess. Mm-hmm. Maybe to the extent that you might want to speak on it, of the true, what you might see as the intentions, the strategic intentions behind this Russian invasion of Ukraine. I know a lot of people say it's due to NATO pressure from the West, NATO expansion talk. I've heard others say that this is a bit of a red herring, that it's more about Vladimir Putin's lasting legacy of wanting to kind of reclaim Soviet territory and really solidify Russia from great power to a superpower. And as any good Risk player knows, securing Eurasia is vital to actually winning the game. So I guess that's where I see maybe the Russians kind of maybe not always wanting to play Robin to Batman if they're Robin and China's Batman. But I guess, what do you think of just in terms of Russia's overall strategic intentions of kind of moving into Ukraine and trying to make that part of Russia again?
Well, again, let me just emphasize that I think we all have to sort of condemn Russia's actions in the strongest terms. I mean, it's appalling. It's and the devastation is huge. And I think this will is an extraordinary danger to Russia in the end. I mean, NATO will be much stronger after this, and Germany's doubling its defense budget. So many reasons, and Ukrainians will hate Russians. If they already hated Russians, they'll hate them 100 times more or 1,000. So, in effect, Putin has created the security threat that he imagined. I guess so it's very hard to step into Putin's shoes here, but I will say that he, as I understand him and the people around him, yes, there is a kind of nostalgia for the past, for a time when Russia was much more powerful, and an appreciation that Ukraine has vast intellectual resources and material resources that could benefit Russia. So at some level, I do think there is a kind of sense of a kind of opportunism there, for example, I mean, not to get too in the weeds, but Crimea, I know for a fact, has had a severe water shortage over the past several years, because all its water came from the north, from the Dnieper. I think there's also maybe an electricity problem too. So I mean, at a very simple level, to make things right for Crimea, which is very important, obviously, to Putin and his people around him. This is kind of just a practical step forward to making good on his promises to secure Crimea. But I do think the larger question of, all these. I mean, again, trying to step into his shoes is difficult, but he probably sees these. He saw what happened in 2014. He saw that there were uprisings in Odessa and Kharkiv and places like that. And he thought to himself, wow, all these people are sympathetic to Russia. Shouldn't they help us with our, to make Russia strong and so forth? So that's kind of how he thinks. Okay, all that being said, I do agree with the people who, Mearsheimer's, general approach, which is that NATO expansion was a major cause of what we're seeing. I could give a few examples that I've seen with my own eyes that I found very disturbing. But I think, I don't think we can have this conversation without, discussing the fact that U.S. policy and NATO policy has been, made some grave errors. And for this, give Mearsheimer some credit, but I mean, George Kennan said it first in 1998 in that famous interview with Tom Friedman, where he said, this is going to be a complete disaster. You're going to create the Russian monster that nobody's thinking about now just by taking these steps. So, working for the Navy for so long as I did, I saw the U.S. Navy not only sortieing very regular forces into the Black Sea, which I think is at a symbolic level was kind of a provocation. I mean, think of the incident last summer where the British warship Defender was parading right off Sevastopol. I mean, this is just a bad idea. It's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. It's just not prudent diplomacy. All right. And just to give another example from the Black Sea area, because I follow the area. I was actually in Moldova a couple of times right before the pandemic. So I've given this Black Sea area a lot of thought lately. But U.S. taxpayers are paying for an upgrade of the piers in Odessa, so that they could be upgraded to the NATO standard and support visits by NATO warships. Well, again, I think this was incredibly foolish. Like I said, waving a red flag in front of a bull. I'm sure one of Putin's war aims is to capture those wharves and make sure the U.S. taxpayer-funded piers in Odessa will service Russian warships, not American. And so, to me, this is just how to put it, this kind of cultural and historical blindness that seems to plague U.S. foreign and defense policy. We should have known that was highly risky. Should have estimated that. And anyway, I could talk about that all night.
Absolutely. There are some good Q&A questions, Foreman, but before I get right to Q&A, I do have kind of one quick question on what's becoming a more and more relevant part of this issue, especially today, is the discussion around no-fly zones. President Zelensky of Ukraine, kind of has made multiple pleas for no-fly zones, and today with Congress. I guess, what is maybe quickly, I know your view on no-fly zones as it pertains to this issue in terms of its effectiveness and what might happen if we were to establish no-fly zones? And I guess on this, to the second part of that question, how would the Chinese potentially respond to Western countries setting up a no-fly zone? And do you think that would encourage them to further engage and support the Russians?
Well, the first answer is pretty simple. I think it's a terrible idea. One of the worst ideas in national security I've heard ever. It's that dangerous. It's letting national security policy be made by our emotions. We're all, of course, we're all horrified to see civilians get pummeled like this. And, we all sympathize with the brave Ukrainians who are defending their homes, but we have to think with our heads. We have to think rationally. And, I will tell you that because I watch Russian nuclear forces very closely. And, I am not joking or exaggerating when I say that the United States could be destroyed in less than an hour. That's the reality. And we have to go about making policy with that in mind. And unfortunately, that's unlikely, right? Nobody thinks that the world is about to be destroyed in a nuclear war. But I have to tell you, as having studied nuclear strategy a lot as well, that, there's something called limited nuclear options. And believe you me, Russia takes that very seriously. And I think if it comes to NATO-Russia combat in and around Poland and Western Ukraine, which looks pretty likely at this point, especially given the Russian, you probably saw the Russian missile strikes against Yovariv the other day, which on the 13th, which signaled that Russia will hit hard against those weapons and volunteers flowing into Ukraine. I think the unstated message there was, if it comes down to it, Russia is ready to vaporize, and I don't say the word lightly, but to literally flatten and vaporize NATO bases and possibly cities in Central Europe. And that might mean Krakow, it might mean Warsaw, it might mean Lviv, it might mean Berlin. This is the sad truth. And I'll tell you, Russia has thousands of tactical nuclear weapons that were built for that purpose. So, I can't emphasize strongly enough that we have to be exceedingly cautious here. And no-fly zone is way over the line. It's not even close for me. I mean, I could work through the mechanics, but I mean, aircraft need runways. They need weapons. They don't just, you don't just fly an aircraft, say good luck.
Right.
That's not how it works. And Russia could easily attack the airfields where they're coming in, and this is has the makings of a complete disaster, in my view.
Absolutely. I'm going to go to our Q&A here for a second. I'm going to attempt to kind of combine the question that was presented by Kyle and Lake. And kind of what Kyle and Lake are both curious about is, one, this is when maybe we'll get into a little bit of the discussion of Taiwan, is with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, do you see China changing or adapting their strategy towards Taiwan, and also maybe changing any sort of timeline that they had in terms of invading Taiwan? And this kind of builds on Lake's question as well. There's been a lot of reports that the Russians haven't been as successful in their kind of blitzkrieg-like war tactics. And do you think kind of this affects the way Xi Jinping might be thinking of Russia and thinking of Taiwan invasion? I know that was kind of a lot, but I hope there's enough.
No, there's a lot there. And if I missed something, do come back at me, because you've got a lot of really, really interesting points there. Let me start with the last one I heard, which is really interesting, which is, are kind of Russian military mistakes, could that have an impact on how Russia and China cooperate? And, I think you have something there. One thing that's remarkable about Russia-China military relations now is you have basically the elite of China's military. It goes to academies in Russia every year. Hundreds of China's best go to Russia. So, I mean, that has many effects, including that it makes them very sympathetic to kind of Russian viewpoints, and a lot of them speak Russian. I've been in Beijing and had many conversations in Russian, actually, with Chinese officers, because they think I'm Russian or something. So it's interesting. But generally, yes, I think there may be a kind of not a rethinking, but a kind of reestimate. But on the other hand, though, they're aware. They know. They weren't under some illusion that the Russian military was some kind of perfect organization. I don't think anybody was. But I mean, Russia has been known through the years for, just for example, some terrible submarine accidents. Think of Kursk, but there are several more actually, including one quite recently in 2019, a fatal accident. So that has occurred. Operations have some been successful, but some not in Syria and so forth. And so, they're aware of these things, and they do joint exercises with the Russians. And, more and more, I think Chinese have been accustomed to the fact that often they have the better equipment. They may be better disciplined. They may be better organized. And Russians have seen that too. And I think that's there too. So, but I mean, and now let's bring this back to Taiwan a little bit. Sure. I think the conventional wisdom at this point on this, and I think it's generally right, is that, nobody expected the Ukrainians to do this well. They have fought skillfully with a lot of bravery. It's been incredible to behold in many ways, David against Goliath, if you will. I think that may inspire people on the island of Taiwan to think that, given the appropriate equipment, if you've got enough javelins and stingers and things like that, and motivated people defending their own homes, that sure tends to motivate people, of course. So the Ukrainians have had high morale, maybe a lot higher than the Russian forces. So yes, I think there are lessons for Taiwan in this equation. And probably this will spur some rethinking in China about the military operation. Because you increasingly got the sense that China felt like, I spent a lot of day reading Chinese military literature, and there was a certain swagger. We got this, we have everything we need, we're ready to go. That was my assessment, really. So I have to think that there could be a kind of a rethinking, maybe a delay, a need to rethink a few things. Now, I want to, so that's conventional wisdom, and I generally agree with all that. But I do want to say on the other side, and here, forgive me for being a professor on the one hand, on the other hand, but I think
octopus analysis.
Yeah, we don't want to take that too far, though. Right. Look, China, in a way, in some ways, they're in much stronger position vis-a-vis Taiwan than Russia is with Ukraine. Let me make a few points here. First of all, Taiwan is about 1/15 the size of Ukraine. It's like a tiny piece of Ukraine. Okay. So you got to keep that in mind. I mean, moreover, China has about 4 to 5 times the defense budget that Russia has. And we see that in the firepower. Okay. In the logistics, in the kind of very singular preparation. So what I'm saying is you basically have something like 5 times the firepower, 5 times the aircraft, 5 times the helicopters, work through all of it in a much smaller area, okay? A much more concentrated area. And that, this spells trouble, right? I mean, and moreover, I think they are taking some of these lessons. One major lesson is that the air power support, the air support, the firepower preparation, to put it in very cold kind of military terms, has to be, much more intense than what Russia has used, in terms of the expenditure of missiles, for example, the destruction of air bases and so forth, and air defenses. So, there are other reasons too, I'll just give you a couple more examples. I mean, 2 critical areas, drone warfare and urban warfare. I watch the Chinese military very closely, and I'll tell you, they are working very hard on both those problems. And so, there's real reason to think that they'll be much better trained and do much better than the Russians in those areas. The Russians seem to be really lacking in drones, in the use of drones in their style of warfare. And they're having trouble because of that. It's very interesting. And they may seek help from the Chinese on this, but I can tell you the Chinese have thousands of drones, and they're very well integrated into their operations and doctrine. They may even be on par or ahead of the United States there. So, but let me stop there. But my bottom line there is Taiwan is still in great danger. And, I would even go as far as to say this, and this I think is quite controversial, but I think it needs to be said, which is, I don't want to second guess the Ukrainian leader, but I mean, not to say his job was easy or something like that, but I do think there was a scope for negotiation, whether was to revive Minsk or declare neutrality. These were options that were on the table, which he did not take. I hope that the Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of Taiwan, or whoever's the leader after Tsai, that she or he conclude that, we have to negotiate our way out of these problems. you don't take the idea of war lightly. I don't know. I've read the press very closely over the last 6 months, and it's almost, this war, everybody saw it coming, right? But so many people kind of dismissed the idea. Now we've seen what it looks like. Would we have behaved differently somehow? I think we would have tried a little harder to reach that deal. I think there were deals to be had. That's my view. I think there were deals to be had in Eastern Europe in dealing with Russia, and there are deals to be had on Taiwan. And I don't think, I'm sad to say that I don't think our diplomats, or other diplomats, unfortunately, I think they have not worked with the necessary determination and realism.
Yeah.
And creativity. That's what's needed. And actually, people of your generation, I hope, can do better.
That's our plan here at JQA. But I do think that's exactly right. So a lot of the analysis was there that made it so obvious that there was a potential invasion coming, but it seemed that people continued to sleep and act like these things don't happen. Anymore.
I have to say, I remember, I read this over and over again in the American press, and it really makes me angry now. But, people would say, well, the Russians talk about war, but we in Ukraine have been at war for the last 8 years. We know all about war. We don't.
Right.
But I mean, in retrospect, that kind of talk looks so foolish, and one has to wish that somebody would have raised their hand and say, "Have you really thought this through? Are you really prepared to go to war because you won't declare you're neutral?"
Absolutely.
I find that, it makes me incredibly sad, because it makes me think all these people did not need to die.
Right. Absolutely. I think it's a very sad situation. I guess before we get, I think there's a little bit more meat on the bone here with this kind of question in terms of maybe the Chinese lessons learned in terms of viewing a potential Taiwan invasion. But on the flip side of that, what are some potential lessons that the United States can take out of this? And I know we're obviously still in the midst of this, so we don't have quite hindsight quite yet. But early on, what kind of lessons can the United States take from this Russia invasion of Ukraine to respond to a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I do think one of them is that again, I have great sympathy for the Ukrainians that are fighting and dying, but in effect, they are. As it were, they're demonstrating the strength of their cause, the strength of their nation. That to state the obvious, the Ukrainians will fight hardest for Ukraine, and Taiwanese would fight hardest for Taiwan. Maybe, I do note that Taiwan's defense budget has been well under 2%. For a very long time, I think for decades. Which doesn't necessarily imply, actually, from what I can assess, that their defenses are quite weak. I think one of the lessons, certainly for Taiwan, but for America too, is that if Taiwan is very serious about its own defense, then they have to put their money where their mouth is and really invigorate the nation's defense, or Taiwan's defense. But it's It's difficult. I don't want to make light of this. I mean, I'm not an advisor in any way to Taiwan, but there is no easy solution. I will tell you, having studied Taiwan scenarios upside down and backwards, I can tell you buying a lot of F-16s doesn't make any sense for Taiwan, or, building out its Navy. No. These are easily targeted, right? I mean, to shut down an airfield is quite simple for China, and they will do it. I don't actually think any, or hardly any, Taiwanese aircraft would get off the ground. So how do you do it? I mean, I think it's laying a lot of concrete. Honestly, that's generally how it has to be done. But I mean, one can imagine Stingers and Javelins, I think, are all in vogue now, and maybe that's appropriate. But look, the larger point I want to make is I do think the U.S. has, if I haven't made it clear, I think the U.S. U.S. diplomacy has really failed Ukrainians. That I think we kind of led them down the garden path. We said, take these weapons. One day, maybe you'll be a NATO member. You have the U.S. behind you. Don't compromise with the Russians. Don't give autonomy to the eastern regions. Don't be bullied by Mr. Putin, and all these things. But we should have been urging them to cut a deal and realizing that, war would be catastrophic, and they really should put a lot more energy into defense, commerce, things that could to develop a way to live peaceably with their neighbor. I mean, it shouldn't be a far-fetched idea that Ukraine and Russia needed to find an accommodation and build up a viable relationship. Pressing Mr. Putin's buttons, I think, has not served Ukraine well, and we should not have been encouraging that. So on Taiwan, I would like to see a couple of things, and by the way, a lot of the people who are a lot of Americans been getting very rich off selling weapons to Taiwan and to Ukraine. But, are they really doing a good thing here? Like I said, all those buying a lot of F-16s, which makes a lot of Americans very rich, doesn't help Taiwan, honestly. So honestly, helping Taiwan would look a little different in my view. And that means it would, it would start with taking the one China policy more seriously. And that, I know a lot of people on Taiwan don't want to hear that, but, 50 years ago, President Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, struck a deal, and it was a pretty good deal, actually. And it was quite, in my view, very wise approach. And the one China policy said, there's one China, and we're not going to dispute that. So, but we basically have, in all but name, we've kind of walked back all the provisions of that agreement, and that, in my view, has the U.S. and China on a, direct course for a military showdown, including a nuclear showdown. So this is really, this is bad for Americans, but it's also bad for Taiwan, because just as Ukraine is being destroyed, that's pretty much what would happen to Taiwan. It might be even worse, as we've discussed. So we need a one China policy that's real, that's substantive, and that would require a lot of change on Capitol Hill, because they're the conventional wisdom is the opposite, that they'd like to torch the one China policy completely, which is what, this idea of strategic clarity, which I think would be a huge mistake, about on par with the no-fly zone idea, basically declaring war with another nuclear power. Okay, so that's one thing. But another thing is, I think we need to advocate for a negotiating track between Taipei and Beijing, which more or less is moribund right now. But it doesn't need to be. There was a very strong negotiating channel that functioned between 2008 and 2016. And in December 2015, the leaders of China and Taiwan had a very amicable meeting. So it doesn't have to be that hard. I mean, imagine Zelensky and Putin sitting down. Well, that's what happened in China-Taiwan relations. But we should encourage that. In my view, we should go all out to encourage that, because that is the solution where people don't get killed and we don't find ourselves in a catastrophic war that could be a nuclear war. So to me, that is critically important. I think there are also ways that the U.S. can lessen tensions there. Building up massive forces in the area is not, I don't think is wise either, because that China surely sees that as a threat. And you have this kind of theory in U.S. national security circles where I hear this more and more, where people openly say, "Hey, Taiwan is the cork in China's bottle. This is how we keep the genie in the bottle, and Taiwan is the cork." This is very wrong-headed thinking, and that's more or less, if not a declaration of war, that's nearly the same thing from China's point of view. I mean, that would be the equivalent of saying, how about Ukraine be the cork in Russia's bottle? I mean, you just cannot take that approach in the world of nuclear weapons that we live in. We have to be more cautious.
Right, absolutely. For our next question here from the Q&A, we'll ask you to be a little bit of a psychic here. Can you potentially walk us through a few of the possible end games with the situation in Ukraine, and how could those kind of potential end games affect Chinese perception of Russia?
Wow, great questions. This is really a great group. You're going to make me work. Well, let me start with the most likely, and then we can work out from there. But I mean, the kind of, if you will, solution, final result maybe of all this mess, all this horrible carnage. If I had to guess, will be a kind of, you'll have Ukraine will be divided. You'll have an Eastern Ukraine that looks something like East Germany used to look like, and a Western Ukraine, which is probably a wealthy NATO-ish state that's a good friend of the West. But East Ukraine will be, as it were, more or less a Russian satellite, I guess, like Belarus. How would China do in that circumstance? I think my guess is, China would kind of muddle through and try to, China's approach to Europe generally has been, just they want to make money off it. And the Silk Road, maybe in some turmoil now, because the Silk Road, the end of it is supposed to be Europe. And if China doesn't get along well with Europe, or China's sees Europe or Eastern Europe in chaos. I mean, China has invested a lot of money in these countries, including Ukraine, by the way, and Belarus. So, I think China would kind of find a way to continue to increase its influence and not to play both sides, but I mean, China, I think, is increasingly skeptical of kind of like partly because of, I think, Lithuania has been particularly forward-leaning and kind of promoting anti-China agenda in Europe. So they're a bit leery, but I mean, China has worked successfully with the Poles and other Eastern European countries. They've had a friend in Greece generally, for example, and done a lot there. So, I think China will be pragmatic. The other scenario as well, I guess we can examine the two poles. I mean, a total Russian defeat, which is conceivable. I mean, we have some reports of morale problems in the Russian military, and as I think possibly in the next week we may see a massive amphibious invasion of Odessa region. That could all go wrong. I mean, it's conceivable, and that could cause immense problems for Putin, who has staked his whole prestige of his regime here. So, I mean, I do think China is very concerned about this. And like I said, they don't want to see the Putin regime go down. They're very worried that Russians who oppose Putin also seem to oppose China. And they're very concerned about that. So, I think in that scenario, China will act quite robustly to help Russia, to help the Putin regime weather a storm, an even bigger storm, if that's what's on the horizon. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, I don't think you're going to see Chinese troops in Russia, policing up order or something like that. No, nothing like that. I don't think China is not, China is more risk averse and knows that any attempt to kind of, how to put it, control the situation is well beyond its power and probably would be, have the opposite effect, just create a lot of anti-Chinese hysteria in Russia. But a total Russian victory here, which also seems unlikely at this point, but it could happen. I think China would say, we had no part in this, but behind closed doors would say, well, you really taught the West a lesson, and right. we're with you, and you're going to have our backs when it's our turn.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Our next question asked, with Biden recently announcing an $800 million military package to Ukraine, do you see the US and also other Western powers giving more direct support to the Ukrainians, or do you kind of see that being, I guess, not a big difference maker in terms of how others are responding?
Well, I mean, look, like I said before, we're all watching the TV, seeing the pictures, and it's horrible. And I hope that our country will step up and help Ukrainians. I think we are doing that a lot, and I think again, you almost cannot. Although I'm very cognizant of the nuclear risks of escalation, it does seem impossible at this point to deny the Ukrainians the weaponry. Although, on the other side, I do think people make a logical argument that this weaponry is just dragging things out and killing more Ukrainians ultimately. Now, I have argued for a long time that Russia has the firepower to just decimate Ukraine. And I think that's what we're seeing to some extent. So, I mean, at some level, I do think it's worth asking: are more Ukrainians just going to die the more we pile weapons in and so forth? So I'm concerned about this, but I certainly condemn the Russian invasion, and I think Russia has to pay costs. I think so. Some of the sanctions are in order. I don't think we should crash the whole global economy for this. But I mean, making Russia pay a price that certainly, I know that's appealing to Americans right now, and I think the middle ground here, I suppose, is we continue to send weapons, but we do not. I just underline again, we should not take the next step up the escalation ladder. I hate to be, I have to be concerned because our country, I do think we have thrown a lot of money around the world in a lot of places. And, I'll just give an example. I mean, a lot of people are talking about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and how we funded that and bled the Soviets white and how that helped bring down the USSR. All true. But let's face it, 9/11 was undertaken by those same people who had been on the CIA payroll, right? I mean, bin Laden was no stranger to the CIA. They knew him. He was their man. And if you don't know the details there, it's pretty scary that we helped create that monster. I think we a little wisdom here might be that just pouring gasoline on this situation may not be the best thing for the people there or just global security in general. I mean, think all these stingers are being sent. Where are they all going to end up? I mean, half of them might make it to the battlefield and half of them may be diverted to the Middle East and end up shooting down big airliners. I mean, you can probably get a lot of money for these on the arms market, right? So, we got to think about these second and third order effects and be cautious. Moreover, this is a lot of American money.
Yeah.
We need to husband our resources. We have a strong military. We want to keep it strong. That's how we defend our country. If I got it right, there's a massive aid package. I think it's like more than $10 billion to Ukraine. Somebody who worked for the Navy for a while, I could say the fleet, we could use $10 billion.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm saying in seriousness, I mean, my approach to defense policy is we defend America. And
right.
That means making sure that we have the best fleet and so forth. And sending all this money abroad, I think is ultimately not the right approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that potentially opens up a can of worms of discussing military preparedness of fighting endless wars and
Right.
not making best use of what we already have. But I'm going to go ahead and drop
In
this.
general, I should say my view on the defense budget is that we should spend it much more wisely, not that we lose the money going to defense.
Absolutely. I'll ask you one last question here in our last few minutes. But before I do that, I am going to drop the link to next week's strategic discussion event, Understanding Nuclear Command and Control, next Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern time, same place. But it's nice that you kind of bring up a little bit of the Afghanistan discussion, because my next question and concluding question for you is, how long do you maybe see the Russians and the Russian government stomaching this invasion if things continue to kind of not go as planned and continuing to face resistance and pockets of resistance from the Ukrainians? Do you see the Russians letting themselves kind of get themselves into an Afghanistan situation that the United States just roughly got out of?
Yeah, I did recently write a piece about the prospects for insurgency. It was before the war started. So, I mean, I think maybe I underrated just how brave and skillful the Ukrainian fighters are. And again, I commend their bravery. By the way, even Russian sources have confirmed how brave the Ukrainian soldiers are. So, I mean, it's I think that's high praise. But I mean, let me put it this way. Look, for Russia, Ukraine is not, Syria. It's not Afghanistan. It's right at home. It's right in their core interest. So, hard to say there's a limit here for what Russia will put into this. And that will impact the insurgency, the prospect for insurgency and counterinsurgency. Another thing is, when Russia was trying to fight counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and when we were trying to do it, let's face it, what we were doing in Afghanistan was not that different from what they were doing operationally. It was very difficult because, we didn't speak the language. How many, Urdu speakers did we have, or Pashto, whatever? This was very difficult. And Russia and Ukraine are in different circumstances. Russia's intelligence apparatus for sort of controlling Ukraine will be much more highly developed and probably more successful. It may be incredibly brutal as well. On the other hand, I have to think, with all the bitterness and anger and weapons flowing through, that even after the dust settles, there will be a potent insurgency in eastern Ukraine, and I think that will be very bloody and costly. But I to get back to your question, I would guess that major combat operations that, again, I'm just guessing on what I know of the Putin regime and what they value, that they would value ending it within 1 year. We're not even a month in, but I think within 1 year, they would definitely want to end the major combat operations. I have to think they probably have a robust plan. By robust, I mean that is well developed for kind of occupying the areas they want to occupy, but they will be severely challenged. I mean, it's, when that many people are dead in such a cruel and awful invasion, an insurgency, I think, is more or less guaranteed. So maybe that's appropriate. There's justice there, I guess, but I'm sad because so many Ukrainians will suffer horribly also during that insurgency.
Of course, absolutely. Well, with that note, we will go ahead and begin concluding for tonight. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your knowledge. And thank you for everyone who came out tonight and tuned in. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. I think this was an incredibly valuable discussion, and I hope that you can join us again, as obviously we weren't able to get to all the Q&A tonight, and I think this will be something that we'll continue to be curious about. Yes.
John, well, let me just say in closing again, I thank you, and I'm sorry about that. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time tonight. And maybe John can circulate my email, because I do like working with students. I think you all are the future, and really can bring a lot of creativity and new approaches to U.S. Foreign and defense policy. So do circulate my email. Maybe I'll send around a few articles too. But thanks for your time and the opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We really appreciated it, and can't wait to work with you again in the future. And yes, thank you everyone for tuning in to our weekly digital strategy discussion. We'll see you all next time, but thank you so much and have a great night.